Hello friends!
Greetings, dear comrades.
Today we're gonna do a format we haven't done in a long time. This will be a reaction video, and we'll be watching a video by Alexey Safronov called Catch-up Modernization versus Socialism. This video is from the channel Simple Numbers. Alexey is an economist who studies the Soviet economy. So let's get started without any introductions or anything like that, because as we go through this video, which is quite a summary in itself, we'll have time to talk about everything.
Friends, I have big news for you. Since I joined the Simple Numbers team, I've not only been preparing scripts for my show Plan A, but I've also been writing a book on the history of the Soviet economy. And this book is finally finished. It should hit the stores in February or March of 2025. Get ready! Alexey Safronov, The Great Soviet Economy, published by Individuum.
So basically we understand that this is the work of an author who has done extensive research, reviewed a huge number of facts, and worked through a massive amount of empirical material. And overall, this video is a summary of the work he has done.
Now let's see how successful a generalization I was able to make.
Alexey.
Now that the book reviewing the entire Soviet economy is finished, it's the perfect time to move on to some generalizations. And that's exactly what today's episode is about. Let's try to look at already known facts from a new perspective. I am among those who believe that socialism was being built in the USSR, but was never completed. And of course, it's interesting to reflect on why that was the case. In my view, a combination of factors played a role.
Well, I think we should pause here, because this is actually one of the fundamental disagreements among Marxists today, and in general, it's a key difference between Marxist-Leninists and opportunists.
I would say between Marxists and non-Marxists, and non-Marxists come in different types. There are those who pretend to be Marxists, there are such people, and there are those who think they are Marxists. That's how I see it, because if Alexey says that there was no socialism in the Soviet Union, in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, then that means we've never had it at all, and that China right now isn't socialist either.
Well, of course, China isn't socialist. That's just for...
No, for him.
For Alexey and authors.
Well, maybe for Alexey and other authors, but I don't think they are Marxists. Who thinks that way? That's my personal opinion.
No, that's not just your personal opinion. That's simply a fact.
It is a fact.
This is one of the fundamental questions. There are other fundamental questions, for example, about proletariat, about the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? What place and what forms it should take, what role it plays in history. The question of imperialism. Which country should be considered imperialist?
The proletariat.
Well, the proletariat, that's what I mentioned, the proletariat, imperialism, the question of China. Again, what is it a socialist country, or is it imperialists, a new hegemon? And these philosophical questions, they just divide,
Well, to be honest, before Alexey, I had never seen or heard the point of view personally that the Soviet Union, it turns out, was not socialist. That's simply a discovery made by Alexey. Well, no, I'm talking about myself now. I understand that there are all sorts of things in this world.
No, for Kostya Semin, this was actually a very important disagreement. When Mikhail Vasilyevich Popov pointed out that Kostya stated in one of his videos that there was no socialism. And in general, that socialism can only be built in all countries together. And that when a country is surrounded by hostile capitalist countries, socialism cannot be built there.
Permanent. Well, in other words, Kostya spoke from the point of view of Comrade Trotsky.
Yes, that's...
Well, all right. So that's a Trotskyist position, a classic, old-school Trotskyist one. I'm just only somewhat familiar with Kostya's work and...
Well, I told you about it.
Thank you very much.
And today we will touch on only one topic, namely the role of the state, or more precisely, the role of the central bureaucratic apparatus in making decisions about economic development.
I have to say, the bureaucratic apparatus, well, the central apparatus, as it is often referred to, is not always strictly bureaucratic.
By the way, that's also that Trotsky's thing about how the bureaucracy will take over everything.
Yes, well, I understand it's kind of a label, right? Well, okay, let's listen.
We'll talk about that.
Let's talk.
Lenin wrote in The State and Revolution that after the proletarian revolution, the proletarian state begins to wither away. The workers themselves organize large-scale production, and state officials are reduced to the role of simple executors of the workers' instructions. he noted that the proletarian state during the transitional period would be a democratic state, in the sense that the minority of the people, that is, the former exploiting classes, would be subordinated to the majority. A democratic state will force the minority to submit to the will of the majority. And as the state withers away, democracy will also wither away, in the sense that people will become accustomed to observing the rules of social life without coercion and without subordination. In the article, "Will the Bolsheviks retain state power?" Lenin explained that the proletarian Soviets would place the state's administrative and accounting apparatus under their control and make it broader and more popular.
We demand that the training in state administration be conducted by conscious workers and soldiers, and that it begin immediately. That is, all working people, all the poor, should be immediately involved in this training. The most important thing is to instill in the oppressed and working people confidence in their own strength, to show them in practice that they can and must themselves take charge of the proper, strictly regulated and organized distribution of bread, all food, milk, clothing, housing, and so on, in the interests of the poor.
At the same time, according to Lenin, the broadest participation in administration had to be combined with centralization.
No one, neither any central body nor any Bolshevik, has ever argued against the centralization of the Soviets or their unification. None of us objects to factory committees organized by branches of production and their centralization.
Thus, it was necessary to somehow combine democracy with centralization. In the first months after the revolution, attempts were made to achieve this by creating a special department, the Council of National Economy, within each local Soviet, and by building a system of sovnarkozes in such a way that the Supreme Council of National Economy would coordinate the plans of the lower-level bodies. I have discussed these ideas in detail in several videos. In practice, the very first years of Soviet power sharply raised the question, what should the central government do if a local Soviet makes an economic decision that the central authority considers to be wrong? In 1919, the chairman of the Supreme Council of National Economy, Alexey Rykov, speaking at a session of the Moscow Soviet Plenum, gave the following example.
But that won't work. I wanted to wait for some kind of conclusion from Alexey and then talk, but it seems like we need to discuss each point as we go, right?
Of course, we can't let anything slip by. First of all, right away about Rykov. Guys, what can I tell you? Who is Rykov? Just so you understand. There is a court report on the case of the anti-Soviet right Trotskyist bloc. And so one of the defendants in this case was, among others, Rykov. So, kids, let me list the surnames of those involved. Ivanov, Krestitsky, Zubarev, Rykov,
Zelensky,
Sharangovich, Kotschaev, Zelensky, Ikramov, Rakovsky, Rosengolds. In short, others mentioned there also include Bukharin, Levin, Ulanov, Yagoda, Kryukhkov, and so on. Now I want to say a few words about what all these comrades were collectively accused of. I'll add that they admitted their guilt, some partially, some with reservations. Here, for example, is the indictment in the case of Bukharin, Rykov, Yagoda, and so on. They were accused of, on the orders of intelligence agencies of foreign states hostile to the Soviet Union, forming a conspiratorial group called the Right Trotskyist Bloc, whose aim was espionage in favor of foreign states, sabotage, diversion, terror, undermining the military power of the USSR, provoking military attacks by these states against the USSR, dismembering the USSR and separating from it Ukraine, Belarus, the Central Asian republics, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the primary region in the Far East in favor of the aforementioned foreign states, and finally overthrowing the existing socialist god. That word is actually here. System in the USSR of the social and state system and the restoration of capitalism, the restoration of the power of the bourgeoisie. So in fact, they were engaged in the same things that Safronov is accused of here. This is the indictment, right? There's more. For anyone interested, you can Google it. Repeat the name. It's available online. It's called the Judicial Report on the case of the anti-Soviet right Trotskyist bloc. Can we attach that as a link to this video?
Well, let's send it.
We'll share it. So in this report, there's an interrogation of Rykov where he admits that he led the creation of terrorist organizations on the territory of the Soviet state, where he admits that people were in fact killed, where he openly admits that they organized the discontented kulaks and called them to rebellion, to uprising, to terror. And at the end of this court report, there is Rykov's final statement in which he says, yes, overall I am guilty of what I am being accused of, but just not to the full extent. You see, now I understand that they killed Peshkov. That's Gorky's son and Gorky himself. And I heard how all of this was being planned, but I didn't pay it any mind. In general, I was responsible for a different area of work. And so, in terms of organizing terrorist organizations, in the murder of Soviet figures and so on, I admit my guilt. But as for Gorky, I wasn't involved in that. Personally, I wasn't involved, although the organization, yes, was engaged in it. Well, it was a large organization. Some parts worked with one intelligence agency, others with another. For example, Trotsky cooperated with the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht. Yes, Trotsky worked with us. He was recruited by them. Some were recruited by British intelligence, but still all of them, yes, were managed according to a single plan. The goal was to bring down the USSR. So, for example, Safronov cites Rykov's words, using him as an example. Let's listen further.
But, I think that's not even enough. That is, first of all, it should be said that Rykov was a person who worked against Soviet power just like the other Trotskyists. Basically, the idea is that every time socialism is put into practical step, industrialization, collectivization, any, they say, no, this is wrong. Either you need to go further to the left, that is, act more radically, or on the contrary, you need to slow things down, like, for example, Bukharin. We'll talk more about this today when he, basically advocated for economic reforms that should start with the peasantry. And here, the exact same question arises when some real problems that exist locally are brought up and a person starts speaking out saying, look, here's a problem like now, for example, with leftist political prisoners saying, look, people here aren't allowed to live, they're constantly being oppressed.
May I say something? Actually, their work was divided into several stages. The first stage was when they openly resisted, that is, they spoke out, they were party members, they were people in the Central Committee.
They organized factions.
Exactly. When they got caught and it became clear that they would be expelled from the party, they changed their policy, they changed the way they operated their tactics. Yes, thank you. And they admitted their mistakes and went underground. That is, they continued to sabotage the things locally, but now they would verbally agree to everything, even though in practice they were undermining the work. And when it became clear that open resistance had failed, and sabotage wasn't having the desired effect, they began to organize acts of terror. That's how it was, folks. And they started working more and more closely with Western intelligence agencies in their interests, because they realized they couldn't overthrow the government on their own. So basically the goal was this, to create chaos here, terror, a civil war. Then the interventionists would come in and start carving up our homeland.
Well, that's exactly what's written in the indictment. They wanted to dismember the country. And what you said about why they went underground, it's because with their factionalism in the party, they couldn't achieve even minimal implementation of their resolutions. This is directly related to democratic centralism, which Alexey didn't understand. How is it even possible to have both democracy and centralism at the same time? But there is such a concept as democratic centralism. It means that within the party, debates take place before the Congress. In other words, there are different opinions. Some are expressed in the press, others as well. There is ongoing debate. But when they arrive at the Congress, after all this debate, everyone is already prepared. They know how and what they will vote for. And everyone already has their own opinion on the matter. They come to the Congress, they vote, and then they carry out what the majority has voted for. This is what is called democratic centralism, when you have the opportunity to express your opinion, but do so before the Congress. Because once the vote at the Congress has taken place...
And you can express your opinion at the Congress too.
Yes. The whole party salutes and carries out what the majority has decided. This is what is called democratic centralism.
You could say that a planned economy is impossible without this kind of approach, right?
Actually, no kind of management is possible without this approach, not even democratic management.
Now I want to read a couple of words. I still want to, yes, say the last word about Rykov. Look, in my final statement, I confirm the admission of my monstrous crimes that I made during the judicial investigation. I betrayed my homeland. This betrayal was expressed in dealings with the sworn enemies of the Soviets, in betting on defeat in their struggle. The right Trotskyist bloc used the entire arsenal of all methods of struggle that had ever been employed by conspiratorial organizations. I was not a secondary figure in this entire counter-revolutionary organization. We were preparing a coup d'etat, organizing kulak uprisings and terrorist cells, and used terror as a method of struggle. And so on and so forth, guys. And there are documents, there are witness testimonies, and so on and so on. By the way, his interrogation is being conducted by Vyshinsky, the famous and highly skilled specialist in his field.
Who, by the way, spoke at the Nuremberg trials.
Yes, well, that name is probably familiar to most people. So Safronov here is appealing to such an authority. Turns out that's considered an authority. Personally, I didn't expect that. All right, well, whatever. They want Trotsky too. But Rykov, guys.
Rykov, Bukharin. Well, yes. And that's not all, by the way, because at the beginning Alexey mentioned state and revolution, showing that according to Lenin, the state is supposed to wither away the state apparatus. So while preparing for this video, I reread State and Revolution. And let me tell you, first of all, I wrote down a ton of quotes from there. Quotes that completely and utterly refute everything Alexey is saying. That's one. And if...
Let's not make baseless claims. I mean, Alexey, it's clear that he isn't familiar with dialectics, that he hasn't studied Hegel. And he, well, he's not a philosopher. He doesn't possess, let's say, the dialectical method. And he perceived the information in that book in a very one-sided, very narrow way. Because the withering away that's actually discussed there means precisely that you can't just abolish it. A must wither away in the course of the state's existence. Well, maybe we can bring up some quotes, or do you want to say something?
Well, I actually have a lot of quotes.
Proceed.
For example, the whole point is that this work, State and Revolution, was written in general against distortions of Marxism. That is, against distortions from two sides. Against the bourgeois Democrats, who claimed that socialism would come by itself and that the capitalist state would transform, well, the bourgeois state, yes, would grow into a socialist state. Those are the bourgeois Democrats. But on the other hand, he also opposed the anarchists who saw, in the words of Marx and Engels, mainly Engels, about the withering away of the state. They claimed that this was about the abolition of the state, that the people should come and abolish it all.
Could you give a couple of quotes? Now look, what is the question here? Why did we focus on the attitude toward the state? Lenin, the question of the attitude of the socialist revolution of the proletariat towards the state thus acquires not only practical political significance, but also the most pressing significance as a question of explaining to the masses what they will have to do to achieve their liberation from the yoke of capital in the near future. So this, you see, is the task. Now about distortion. What is happening now with Marxist teaching is what has often happened in history with the teachings of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes in their struggle for liberation. The oppressing classes during the lifetimes of the great revolutionaries repaid them with constant persecution, met their actions with the wildest malice, the most furious hatred, and the most reckless campaigns of lies and slander. After their deaths, attempts are made to turn them into harmless icons, so to speak, to canonize them, to grant a certain fame to their names as a comfort to the oppressed classes, and to deceive them by hollowing out the substance of their revolutionary teachings, blunting their revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing them. That's how it is, guys. So if you say something about the state or...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So... Speaking in general terms, yes, even without getting into the quotes right now, the logic there is that at first the proletariat must seize the state and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is, the bourgeois state is destroyed, and in its place comes the state of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it's still a state, but a different one, which represents true democracy, one that works and functions in the interests of the majority of the population. That's what this democracy is. And then, after the dictatorship of the proletariat takes power, the state gradually begins to wither away. And here I'd even like to quote, "The first act in which the state truly acts as the representative of the whole society taking possession of the means of production in the name of society is at the same time its last independent act as a state. The intervention of state power in social relations then becomes superfluous in one area after another and naturally fades away on its own. The administration of things in the direction of production processes replaces the governance over people. The state is not abolished, it withers away. On this basis, one should assess the phrase free people state, a phrase that for a time had a legitimate agitational purpose, but is ultimately scientifically untenable." Yes, let's emphasize this point. This free people state that has already been mentioned and about which Alexey will talk a lot more. It is scientifically untenable. This is what Engels writes in Anti-Düring. On this basis, one should also assess the demands of the so-called anarchists that the state be abolished overnight. And here Lenin specifically emphasizes, yes, by quoting Engels, that the concept of the withering away of the state, as it is commonly widely and, if you will, popularly understood, undoubtedly leads to obscuring, if not outright denying, the revolution. But this is already directed against the bourgeois democrats. The essence here comes down to the fact that this state is no longer an apparatus of repression in the hands of the ruling bourgeois class. It represents an economic apparatus that manages, among other things, the production process. And there are also some political details involved. For example, how the militia differs from the police, both in the bourgeois state and otherwise, and many, many other details. But specifically, since we are talking about the economy here, the management of the national economy through the state must continue until the complete withering away of classes. And Lenin says that when this withering away happens, it is a very, very, very long process, which does not just happen like that instantly.
That's the first point. And the second is the same quote from Lenin, that a socialist state cannot exist for a long time surrounded by capitalist countries. So right now, we're only talking about some internal problems, yes, but there are also external ones, guys. Even if everything is going well internally, for example, things are actually going pretty well in China right now, by the way. From an economic point of view, yes. From a cultural point of view, from a political point of view, everything is fine. But can China now, for example, polish its borders, remove border guards, deprive itself of an army protection, right? Well, what would happen to them if, for instance, they didn't have armed forces? What would happen to China if they simply destroyed their statehood right now? Surrounded there, on one side by the United States, Japan, the NATO bloc. Well, what do you think will happen to them, guys? Even if everything is going well economically, they will be destroyed.
Lenin writes, "We are not utopians. We do not dream of immediately doing without any administration, without any subordination." These anarchist dreams, based on a misunderstanding of the tasks of the dictatorship of the proletariat, are fundamentally alien to Marxism and, in reality, only serve to delay the socialist revolution until people become different. No, we want a socialist revolution with people as they are now, who cannot do without subordination, without control, without overseers and accountants. But they must submit to the armed vanguard of all the exploited and working people, the proletariat. The specific authority of state officials can and should be immediately, from one day to the next, replaced by the simple functions of overseers and accountants. These are functions that are already entirely within the reach of the urban population's level of development and can easily be performed for a worker's wage.
Well, yes.
In general, the idea that everyone will gather, for example, in the courtyard of their building and decide what to produce, and will see that this is exactly the idea Alexey is promoting, was never advocated, not even by the most radical socialists or anarchists. That is, it was not about managing the economy or running economic affairs, even in that sense, but rather, for example, about political governance. So it was about punishments and so on, about some kind of penal system.
Yes, we're talking a lot. Let's turn it on.
Here's an example. In 1919, at a meeting of the Moscow Soviet's plenum, the following example was given. There was only one factory left in the country that produced special spools for the thread industry.
In one of the districts, there was a factory that made spools, but the local council decided to repair it and, instead of making spools, to produce household items, wooden cups, spoons, and the like. From our point of view, this factory should have been entirely dedicated to producing spools, because we cannot hold the thread industry. And there was no hope of getting spools from Finland or Sweden, nor is there any now. Over this issue there was a squabble between us and this district council that lasted for weeks. From the standpoint of the interests of all the working people of the state, we believe that the interests of this particular locality and district should be sacrificed.
Naturally, the squabble between the Supreme Council of the National Economy and the local council arose only from the general.
What I also don't understand is why Alexey calls the interaction between the council and the authorities a squabble that was going on. How does he even imagine that? You know, it's like the movie Garage. Yes, that's what you would call a squabble. Look at the beautiful words he comes up with, right?
Key poverty. If there had been more than one spool factory in the country, or if the local council could have obtained cups and spoons in some other way, no sacrifices would have been necessary. Unfortunately, after the Civil War, the country was left with literally nothing. And contradictions of this kind arose constantly.
That's life. In fact, the mainstream understanding of economics today even gives this definition. Economics is the science that deals with the issues of production and distribution of goods under conditions of limited resources and unlimited needs, right? So the question of something being in short supply somewhere is always present. And of course, we're not even talking about the level of development of production and productive forces 100 years ago. Naturally, you have to set priorities. That's the whole point of planned production. And it's clear that some people want more milk, others want more steel, and still others want to sell their wheat, for example, at a higher price, and so on. And these are the issues that have to be resolved specifically within the framework of economics. To say that the decisions made here were wrong is, of course, incorrect.
I've already talked about how, in 1920, the Bolsheviks came to the idea of the GOELRO plan and the necessity of creating Gosplan and carrying out catch-up modernization from above, relying on advanced examples of Western technology.
And really, if you have a backward economy, how else can you describe it except as catch-up, right? I don't think you can call it anything else. That's normal. And of course, you have to take examples from advanced technology, of course, the technologies, right?
What's really interesting is that at the beginning of the last century, specifically in the 1920s, there was quite an active and heated debate between the supporters. Bukharin was a very ardent representative of their self-modernization that would start with consumer goods. In other words, he talked about the integration of the kulak into socialism, that it was necessary to give more opportunities and freedom for activity specifically to the peasants so that they could become wealthier. And as they became wealthier, the rest of the economy would grow as well. So we start with consumer goods, and then as a result, the production of means of production increases.
So not starting from the base of means of production, but rather with consumer goods, right?
That was the first point of view. And the second point of view, on the contrary, argued that we needed to develop heavy industry, that is machinery, equipment, metallurgy, all of that. And then, having created that base namesake, heavy industry, it would be possible to create equipment for the production of consumer goods as well as the consumer goods themselves. And so this scientific debate was taking place. And at that time, Feldman's truly unique model was created. He was a Soviet economist who mathematically proved that, first of all, in heavy industry, there isn't actually such a drop in consumer goods production as was previously thought. In other words, it seemed that if we directed all resources into heavy industry, we would end up with famine. That is, people would literally have nothing to eat. But he calculated mathematically and showed that, first of all, no, there wouldn't be such a drop right away. And in a fairly short time frame, literally a couple of years or so, there would actually be accelerated production, including of consumer goods.
Within 5 years?
It would happen very quickly, and in fact, that's exactly what happened. And let's not forget, for example, our 5-story apartment buildings, the Khrushchev-Kas, they weren't built just for the sake of it. They were constructed, first of all, according to previously agreed upon plans. It wasn't Khrushchev who came up with the idea and provided housing for the majority of the population. They were made possible because the house building factories had already been built, and it was on the basis of this more advanced heavy industry that it became possible to produce more consumer-oriented goods, including rapid housing construction and everything else. And we're not even talking about the victory in the war. In general, the victory in the Great Patriotic War was the result of this economic policy that began with heavy industry.
And I would say it wasn't just economic policy, it was a war between two economic systems. Two systems were fighting. The socialist one, which, as Alexey here says, was never actually built. And the capitalist one. And according to Alexey, if you follow his logic all the way, it turns out that we had two capitalist systems competing, right? Or maybe someone else might say they were fighting for markets. Could that be the case? After all, for example, the Soviet Union, Inum, preparing for war with fascist Germany, not just Germany, but the West in general. For instance, the Winter War with Finland was that a war of aggression. Could we call it that?
The Winter War with Finland resembles Khrushchev's war.
Yes, guys.
Parallels.
So it turns out that we come to the point of view that the Soviet Union attacked the entire civilized world, right? And the whole world was forced to defend itself. That's how it is. And then this whole thing started. Whose side are you on? Well, you could be on the side of the SS Galician. So what's the big deal? They were people with machine guns too. They wore helmets too. Or you could be on the side of, I don't know, some Soviets, the Soviet army, sure, Soviet people. That's how it is.
So the question of what exactly to produce, of course, he was rising and had to rise. And first of all, yes, it was brought up in local councils. Inevitably, it was also discussed in private, in kitchens. That is, people would just sit at home and say, damn, why are they making locomotives, for example, instead of giving us food when we are not building us houses? Because that's what we really need right now. The fact that there would be a lot of dissatisfied people is undeniable. But planning implies moving along the best, most efficient path, which is supposed to ensure the growth of well-being for the entire population, not just for certain groups.
Explaining the political meaning of the GOELRO plan, he wrote that skipping stages of technical development should create the material foundation for leaping over stages of social development, going straight from backwardness to socialism. In the name of this lofty mission, the state considered it acceptable to increase the centralization of industry and the concentration of resources. The implementation of catch-up development plans justified sacrificing the interests of certain regions and even entire classes.
I didn't really understand. Is he being sarcastic here? Is Alexey mocking this development, this leap from backwardness to socialism, or is he just having trouble reading from the teleprompter? I don't know.
Well, I think he doesn't agree with the policy.
Yeah, I get that impression too.
I think, first of all, well, how would I start? What is socialism anyway? Capitalism has its own goal, right? That's profit.
Maximizing profit.
Maximizing profit. And then there's socialism, whose goal is comprehensive development, right?
Yes, the growth of well-being and all-around development of all in society.
These are two different societies with fundamentally different goals for their existence. And the direction of development in one society is aimed at one goal, while in the other, it's aimed at a different goal.
So if in socialism the enrichment and well-being of everyone is the goal, then in the other system it's the enrichment of a select few. That's the most important difference.
Yes, and enrichment for everyone means that you don't have a class that lives at the expense of others, right? And vice versa, right? And so it turns out that Alexey is expressing the idea well. At least that's what I sense from his tone and the meaning that all of this upheaval happened in a way that was much too harsh.
I even heard a hint of mockery, like from backwardness to socialism, as if that's something to scoff at. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's just a certain tone of voice.
Well, let me tell you, both the Soviet experience and the Chinese experience, just look at China, for example, guys, from backwardness, well, and the Soviet socialism and the Soviet experience, it's the same thing. Well, the Soviet experience is the same thing. How else could it be? From backwardness, where else would it come from? Under capitalism in Tsarist Russia. Well, how did people live? Guys, come on.
It's not as complicated as it seems. You have point A. That is, you understand that your country is first of all agrarian, and second, from a technological standpoint, in order to build a modern, prosperous economy, it lacks electrification and lacks enterprises that would be built on the basis of modern technologies. And from the perspective of science, specialists, engineers, there are people who understand this. They know, for example, that in this area, a hydroelectric power station needs to be built.
Yes.
Let's say industrial complexes too.
And here, for example, you have coal, so you can build some kind of facility that will extract and use this coal, let's say, something like a steel plant, I don't know.
And there's absolutely nothing special about taking a plan and calculating how to organize all this properly so that it works efficiently. And the issue here isn't that it's impossible to do, but rather the question of political will, which neither the Tsars nor the bourgeois government were able to provide. I mean, the provisional government, which lasted less than a year in 1917. But the Bolsheviks did provide that and in fact demonstrated their effectiveness.
After a prolonged struggle over the sources of funding for industrialization, Stalin's viewpoint prevailed.
This is Feldman's viewpoint, exactly what I was talking about. Stalin supported it because it was simply the correct and reasonable position from an economic standpoint.
If we are talking about Marxism, then Marxism is a scientific worldview, guys. The thing is, Marxism is a science, guys, and it's not about Stalin's opinion, right? It was the scientific point of view that prevailed. That's the advantage of Marxism. It's not like what you see now in the United States, where it's all chaos and confusion, right? One moment it's this way, then it's that way, then back again. Sometimes it's one policy, then another. Sometimes Rockefeller's interests prevail, then Morgan's, then someone else's. Sometimes one corporation surges ahead, then another, right? In other words, chaos.
So again, we get the impression here that Stalin was some kind of voluntarist, that he just crushed everyone. There were good specialists and economists who proposed a reasonable path of development without any sacrifice as well, like Rykov, for example, right? And Bukharin is about integrating the kulak into socialism.
And by the way, about Bukharin, in that criminal case we mentioned at the beginning, his testimony is there as well. It's the same thing, guys.
They're together.
Yes, exactly. One organization, one shady operation. The fact that Safronov puts them all on the same level. I mean, for me, guys, I don't know. It's just nonsense.
Decisions in the party, in the Soviets, were not made that way. It was a scientifically coordinated decision which was confirmed by mathematical models. As I already mentioned, the Feldman model, which actually became the foundation for future economic theories.
In 1928, at the plenum of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, it was stated that the peasantry pays and will continue for some time to pay something like a tribute.
Not stated, but explained.
Namely, an additional tax, which essentially means that they overpay for industrial goods and, as a result, receive less for their agricultural products.
That is the essence of the socialist planned economy. This is what distinguishes socialism from capitalism. Within a unified state plan, you can redistribute resources. In other words, your task is to make this economy as efficient as possible. And where there is a little more, you shift from one basket to another.
In short, you pull up those who are lagging behind, right? Taking a little from those who are doing fine, right?
You have the task of developing industry. You need to get resources for this industry from somewhere, so you look at where you can take them from. And here Stalin explains that we have a temporary measure. Alexey will also read it out in a moment, that we have a temporary measure where we redistribute wealth
Thus,
in this particular manner. When our issues and problems are resolved, when the purpose for all of this is achieved, this measure will be abolished.
and what's interesting is you had that impression earlier on, right, a little while ago, and now I have it that Alexei is expressing it as if Stalin said, let's go rob the peasants, let's take advantage of the peasants for our own benefit. So basically he's saying that we're going to live at the expense of the peasant class, that we should just live off the peasant class. Stalin, you see, just suggested it,
Basically,
and everyone agreed.
he's taking a Bukharinist, anti-Stalinist position.
In this case, the situation with the peasantry is as follows. They pay the state not only the usual taxes, both direct and indirect, but they also overpay due to the relatively high prices for goods from industry. That's the first point. And they also receive less for their agricultural products because of the prices. That's the second point. This is an additional tax on the peasantry in the interests of developing industry, which serves the entire country, including the peasantry itself. This is something like a tribute, a kind of extra tax that we are forced to collect temporarily in order to maintain and further develop the current pace of industrial growth, to provide industry for the entire country. This is an additional
to further improve countryside well-being and eventually eliminate this extra tax, closing the gap between city and countryside.
He explained it perfectly, explained and showed that we cannot move forward until our industry is developed, until we have factories that produce machines and equipment so that we can continue to create, in other words, to move ahead. That's it. Modern economics demands this. Just like now, the economy requires robotization. We can't just, in 2020, what year is it?
Fifth.
In the fifth year, move forward with a spinning wheel and just, for example, hand out...
Compete.
Well, basically develop the economy. So we need robotization, we need artificial intelligence, and whether we like it or not, we have to invest the country's resources into this.
Well, when I look at Alexey, my personal impression is that he doesn't understand what he's talking about. In other words, this is absolutely not his area. I don't know, maybe he's an economist, but when it comes to Marxism, Leninism, philosophy, well...
That's the key point. He's not a Marxist.
He's not a Marxist.
He knows the facts about the Soviet economy. He knows the empirical material, how things were, what happened, why, and how it all developed. But as for the internal mechanisms of self-movement, the contradictions from which all this arose, the principles of Marxism doesn't understand them.
In reality, something like a tribute had to be collected not only from the peasantry, but from the entire population of the country. After the tax reform of the early 1930s, a turnover tax was included in the retail price of all consumer goods, which became the main source of revenue for the state budget.
And what other main source of income could a state have? For example, Western countries had colonies, right?
Well, they have taxes there too. Here we have VAT, profit tax, tax on mineral resources, tax on...
I'm saying, what could be different in a state? I mean, Alexey talks as if, well, what are you idiots? Why are you torturing people? You have socialism, so let's just abolish taxes. So he wants to abolish the state, abolish taxes, and just have everything like...
He has some kind of wild, completely unscientific anarchism. How does the economy work in principle? In order for this common economy to function, as we've already said, resources need to be allocated somehow, that's one. And if we just take and distribute money equally to everyone, then factories, plants, roads, electricity supply, water supply, many systems, healthcare, and education simply won't be able to function.
Lenin described this very well in his work about capitalism in Tsarist Russia, saying that even if you distribute all the land equally among the peasants, someone will still owe something to someone else. For example, someone who likes to drink might trade away his plot for a bottle. So in the end, all that land will still end up concentrated in the hands of the wealthiest.
Some people have more children, some have fewer.
Yes. So even if you just distribute all the money, all the wealth, or anything else equally, it will all end up in the hands of a few again. That's what happened. This process just played out over hundreds of years in history, well, maybe even 1,000, you could say. Well, with capitalism, right? Let's say so, you see? So all of this has already happened, and we can see how it unfolded. It's been described by great scholars, and...
Well, it's different there. It all started with the chiefs. Well, never mind.
No, yeah, let's not complicate things right now. Basically, if you give everyone the same piece of whatever it is, yes, it will all still end up in the hands of the chosen few. In the end...
the state treasury is, well, the people's common fund from which the entire economy is built. And, excuse me, when you later receive your free benefits from this common fund, including the opportunity to build yourself a house or move into an apartment, healthcare, education, even security, because the police also have to function somehow and ensure public safety. The army also has to function somehow. Exactly. All of that is part of the common fund as well. And a growing economy means that there are more and more goods, well, products in this case, they're not even considered goods anymore under socialism. So the standard of living of the population keeps rising. In other words, you end up having more and more of everything. And the more socialist enterprises expand, the more they are able to provide everyone with their products, whether it's boots, steel, or even armaments.
Rubles, or 56% of all the revenues in the USSR budget. Out of that amount, heavy industry contributed only 17 billion.
Well, that's really logical, because heavy industry was developed first and foremost, and all those resources were directed toward it.
Well, it's interesting. Why doesn't he say what he would have done or give his own point of view? Like, he says that the Soviet leaders were forced to make these kinds of wrong decisions. So it's like they're not bad people, but life itself was just that hard.
He specifically wants, well, why should we, like ordinary people, he puts himself in their shoes and says, why should I have to pay? Why am I being taxed? That's what he says.
The rest went to light and food industries, trade, procurement, and other sectors. That same year, budget expenditures on industry amounted to 78 billion, of which 69 billion went to heavy industry. The light and food industries paid a total of 155 billion rubles in turnover tax, but received only 8 billion rubles for development. From these figures, it is already clear that a more important issue than just the size of the tribute or supertax is that the state claims the right to decide which industries should be developed, especially without much consultation with ordinary workers.
Well, I mean, just imagine, let's say, yes, we have a planned economy and the entire state develops according to a single plan. And each of us is asked, what do you want to develop? And one person says, I want to develop iPhones. Another says, I want to develop, sausage. A third says, I want to develop this thing over here. Things like this aren't done by consulting with everyone. Things like these are done according to a plan in the interest of the majority. And the interest of the majority mean the fastest and most effective development of the entire economy as a whole. Naturally, both consumer goods and heavy industry were taken into account there. But again, I'll repeat, without heavy industry, it's impossible to produce consumer goods. You need to make them using some kind of machines with equipment. You either have to buy these machines and equipment, which either no one will sell to you, or it will cost you an arm and a leg and increase your dependence, or you have to produce them yourself. And let's not forget that all these enterprises are also dual purpose.
And here he goes on to say that the state, used to deceive people like that. In other words, he doesn't understand the essence that there is a state, right? In which there is socialism, naturally the dictatorship of the proletariat, naturally party leadership, naturally, and the theory of Marxism, Leninism, naturally. And this state, well, the proletariat, as Engels said, the proletariat seizes state power and turns the means of production, first and foremost, into state property. But by doing so, it destroys itself as the proletariat. In doing so, it eliminates all class distinctions, class oppositions, and along with them, the state as such. That is, the state as a state. And do you understand what the point is? That the socialist state works in the interests of society, in the interests of the majority. And yes, it has a certain form. It's impossible.
Actually, you can give a simple example of how we act within a family. Yes, every family acts this way. If we have some shared income, let's say, for example, the father works, the mother is beautiful, and there are 3 children. If everyone starts saying, I want my exact share of dad's income, then nothing good will come of it, because the daughter will spend it all on candy, the son on some gadgets, and so on, and the mother on a dress. But if they act together as, well, a single household, then they might, save up for a car, a TV, or do other things like that. And as a result, each person will get less individually. So this is a completely reasonable, normal way of managing resources, even in such a tiny economic unit as a family. Anyone who runs a business or makes management decisions also understands that even in a company, if it's organized as, say, a cooperative where everyone owns an equal share, people don't just break up the business and take their equal portion. They invest more and more money so that the enterprise can grow. And this growth ensures the increase in the well-being of each of them.
Can I read a little bit? Here is the Stalin constitution. Look, the social structure. Guys, I don't know, I've read it, Alexey hasn't. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is a socialist state of workers and peasants. First. Second, the political foundation of the USSR is made up of the Soviets of Workers' Deputies, which emerged and strengthened as a result of the overthrow of the power of the landlords and capitalists and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. All power in the USSR belongs to the working people of the city and countryside, represented by the Soviets of Workers' Deputies. 4. The economic foundation of the USSR consists of the socialist system of the economy and socialist ownership of the instruments and means of production, which were established as a result of the elimination of the capitalist system of the economy, the abolition of private ownership of the instruments and means of production, and the eradication of the exploitation of man by man. Article 5. Socialist property in the USSR takes the form either of state property or of cooperative collective farm property. Article 6. The land, its mineral resources, waters, and so on and so forth are state property, that is the property of the entire people. 7th, public enterprises in collective farms,
Co-ops.
and in cooperative organizations with all their living and non-living assets. Well, all of this also belongs to the people. Then the land goes to the collective farms in general, and so on and so forth. So it turns out that the state form, yes, the state form works in the interests of the people. In essence, this is a people state. How else would you organize it if every village, every settlement is going to pull in its own direction? Well, how is that even possible? Let him explain then. So he comes with this kind of claim.
We'll talk about that later. That's exactly how the Sovnarkozes were created, based on that principle, which is why the collapse began.
Yes, so anyone who served in the army, please tell me, would a unit be combat ready if every private decided for himself how he was going to act next?
No economic unit can function without management. And today we no longer live in a communal or clan-based system. We live in a complex economy where large economic entities operate. These are factories, associations of factories and plants, scientific institutes. In short, you can't do without accountants, lawyers, management, or unified coordination of these economic units. To put it simply, it's just nonsense when people say, why don't you ask me if I need a Zhiguli car or if I need your flour that you produce?
And here's Article 11. The economic life of the USSR is determined and directed by the state national economic plan in the interests of increasing public wealth, the steady rise of the material and cultural standard of the working people, strengthening the independence of the USSR, and enhancing its defense capability.
By the way, this is a very good article that really illustrates the point.
This isn't an article, it's the Constitution.
Article 21 of the Constitution, which really demonstrates this, but wait, let's see whether it was actually followed, right? Well, it's probably important to look at what was done and whether it really was in the interests of the working people. And we'll see that, yes, in fact, the level of education increased, the level of housing provision improved, and the level of nutrition, both in terms of calorie intake and dietary variety, also went up. And things like sports participation and just about everything else as well.
You can't even list everything. They became the world's second largest economy, went into space, defeated the fascists, guys, repelled the intervention, the Union, defeated the Western countries. And excuse me, but what great writers, what scientists, what artists, what physicists, how, where?
So this kind of rhetoric about the state taking away people's resources and wealth, well, honestly, for an economist, it's just shameful and disgraceful not to understand such basic things.
Of course, there will be legal idealists who will say that the law on the 5-year plan was approved by the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. And the Supreme Soviet, after all, represented all the working people.
Now, I'd like to understand, legal idealists, it sounds almost like an insult, but here it seems like Alexey is using the word idealists to mean people who believe in ideals. But from a philosophical point of view, an idealist is, well, basically the opposite of a materialist. That is a person who doesn't...
So he wants to say that the communists had more idealistic views and notions according to which they built this system. I'm curious
Idealistic views imply that consciousness is essentially primary, not matter, that ideas do not arise from real facts of life, but rather they are invented on their own.
And again, another question for Alexey. So what do you propose? All right, fine. Capitalism, you seem not to support capitalism, at least in words. In words, you're against what the communists built. And why are you here? How exactly? So, well, describe your system. I mean, he says, this is bad, that's not right, this isn't it, and here are some idealists. Well, tell us, all right? How, what exactly? Where is the positive program? It sounds like naivism. It's just bad, 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 bad. I'm against it.
That sounds like some kind of anarchism. Well,
no, this sounds like anarchism.
It's just that, for example, the text of the law on, say, the 9th five-year plan is only 5 pages long. It only sets out the most...
What do you mean, only 5?
Well, listen.
General features of future development. The actual instructions on who needed to do what in the following year were contained in the annual plans. And each such plan is a stack of tables 1.5 meters tall. And the approved annual plans for the development of the national economy for the 9th five-year plan are still not declassified in the economic archive. In other words, the broad masses of working people not only didn't participate in drafting the annual plans, the broad masses of working people still can't even see them.
I'll go even further. No, I'll go even further. The broad masses the broad masses of working people did not participate in the development of
the nuclear program.
The nuclear program. The rockets. The ones that Gagarin flew on, you understand? Apparently the peasants and workers should have taken part in that too, right?
So that everyone would be asked, do you agree that such and such an amount of steel will be produced?
No. Why even ask? They could have just assembled the rocket and Gagarin would have flown, and why did Gagarin fly anyway? Would any of them have, why did they assemble just one rocket, you see? Here's the real question. On what grounds, for what reason that is, Safronov is asking us, on what grounds did specialists in their own field decide how that field would develop and function? By what rules? And according to what principles in general? So, then, Safronov, tell me, how about you? What about what you're saying? Why did you write it alone without the people? What you're saying right now, here, in this video, who else took part in it? 5, 10, 20 people? Why not? There are actually 125 million people living here, you know? Did any of them take part in this, or was it just you?
Well, regarding the legal idealists about the Supreme Soviet, let's not forget what councils are and how they function. The Soviets were organized first by production and later by territorial principle. In other words, these are people who nominated their own delegates, who then moved up to a higher level of the Soviet, like the City Council and so on, all the way up to the Supreme Soviet. So these were direct representatives of the people from the local areas who expressed their will, and these plans were coordinated with them. Of course, it wasn't coordinated in such a way that, say, Vasily Petrovich from Kaluga, please tell us how much steel we should produce today. Or you, Mikhail Sergeyevich, tell us, are we doing the right thing by delivering this much wheat? Of course, it wasn't done like that. They were simply informed about how much of what needed to be produced, and people, seeing how their lives were changing, whether things were getting better or worse, they would evaluate the work of these specialists, among others, and could influence that work. That's what true democracy is, not when you're just asked, what should we produce? Are we going to produce rockets or Zhiguli cars? Obviously, that's not how it works.
Even though 50 years have already passed. The lack of workers' participation in drawing up the plans in practice led to the plans including things that workers didn't actually need. And Rykov...
Phew.
It wasn't rockets or tanks that the workers needed.
Yes, neither education, nor hospitals, nor schools were needed by the workers. So what then, well, go on, what did Rykov say?
In 1919 and Stalin in 1928 both emphasized that sacrificing the interests of certain groups of the population was a temporary phenomenon, an inevitable evil that was necessary only until we developed industry.
And so he puts Rykov and Stalin on the same level?
Stalin has a book called Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. But he is not an economist, so these are simply commentaries that he provides.
And indeed, the plan for the second five-year plan already included that the production of consumer goods would develop at an accelerated pace. In February 1932, the 17th Party Conference set the goal of tripling per capita consumption by the end of the second five-year plan. The approved plan was a bit more modest. With national income projected to grow 2.2 times over the five-year period, the consumption fund was planned to increase by 2.4 times. But due to the need to prepare for war, the plans were revised, and the production of consumer goods once again developed more slowly than the production of means of production. Later on, this story repeated itself almost every five-year plan. For example, in the law on the ninth five-year plan, very one that is only 5 pages long, the goal was also set to develop the production of consumer goods at an accelerated pace. And this requirement was once again not fulfilled. In fact, out of all 12 Soviet five-year plans, the production of consumer goods outpaced other sectors in only 2. After the war, when the defense industry was being converted, and in the years 1981 to 1985. Of course, to produce consumer goods, you first need to build factories that manufacture consumer goods.
But first, you have to ask everyone if it's the right thing to do, right?
No, you have to ask Rykov and Bukharin. They always give the right advice.
It's strange that it wasn't Trotsky. It's just that Trotsky is apparently so well known, while it seems like Bukharin and Rykov aren't as familiar to the average person, so you can just mention their names.
The production of consumer goods can't always grow faster than the production of means of production. But in this case, what interests us is that even when the government intended to develop the production of consumer goods faster, the plans were constantly being adjusted, and there were always some objective reasons to reconsider.
For example, war.
And when I say objective reasons, I'm not being sarcastic. What could be more objective than the need to defend against the fascists? But after the Great Patriotic War, the Cold War began, the colonial system started to collapse, and the Soviet Union became involved in the struggle over the development path of the new states in Asia and Africa.
You asked whether Alexey sees any differences between the various periods of the Soviet economy. He doesn't see any differences.
Well, look, it's kind of going according to the canon for us. Vladimir Ilyich and Joseph Vissarionovich. After the death of Joseph Vissarionovich, Khrushchev came to power, and in 1961 at the Party Congress, he abolished the dictatorship of the proletariat. Right from the moment he took power, he started dismantling the MTS stations and so on, putting his own people in place. It was immediately clear to everyone that he was not a communist. He began to dismantle the Soviet Union together with his comrades. Khrushchev was not alone. Khrushchevism, there were many such Khrushchevs. They came to power, and accordingly, in 1961, the counter-revolution began, right? That's all there is to it. That's why the post-Stalin Soviet Union, the Leninist Soviet Union, and the Khrushchev-era Soviet Union, there is a dividing line, a very clear boundary. These are two very fundamentally different things. So the first part is Marxism, Leninism, as it truly is. And in the historical circumstances that had developed at that time, yes, the development was going in the right direction. And after that, we see liberalization. That's what led us to where we were by 1991, right?
Now, Alexey is actually about to talk about these soft narcoses. I also want to talk about them, but I'll wait until he brings up the topic.
So, as he says, comparing 1985 and say the 1950s, well, that's not really accurate. In terms of the numbers, yes, but in terms of the substancino...
What he's saying about the substance is exactly right, that there were always certain objective reasons. And at first he says that the objective reason is the war, and indeed one plan was set for the 5-year period and it had to be adjusted. But plans, they aren't dogma. In general, the positive beneficial side of plans is that as we implement them, we can see where we've made mistakes. There's nothing terrible about that, and we make adjustments based on reality.
It's not just about where we made mistakes, but also where we didn't understand, because
we missed something.
Many 5-year plans actually progressed at an accelerated pace. They were completed in 4, sometimes even 3 years. Do you know what that means? The theory, it's tested in practice, and after being tested in practice, the theory, changes.
Revised.
Yes, exactly, it gets revised. That's what Safronov is aiming for, generalization, right? The experience gets generalized, and the theory is supplemented with something new. It's not just changed chaotically or replaced by another theory, it's the development of history. So something else gets added and added and added.
Theories.
Yes.
Well, in general, that's completely incorrect. That the plans were adjusted, that's true. But equating the Khrushchev era with the Stalin era is absolutely impossible, because politically these are two entirely different systems. If the Stalin era was socialism, then the Khrushchev era was already a counter-revolution and a departure from socialism.
The coming yes, his.
Yes.
It was necessary to supply raw materials and energy to the Eastern European countries, because the Soviet Union had oil and gas deposits. But Czechoslovakia or the GDR were less fortunate when it came to mineral resources. In general, the arguments always...
Well, not because they were less fortunate, but because we were helping friendly countries.
Well, and besides, oil and gas are the resources we trade now, and our country has a surplus of them. We don't process all of it.
We had them. For the Soviet Union, catch-up modernization was absolutely necessary. My video is not an attempt to revise history or correct the Soviet...
Exactly.
An attempt.
An attempt to revise history, to revise the theory.
And to make a false generalization.
Yes, but we'll summarize that at the end, a generalization of the generalizer.
Of the leaders. But I want to strongly caution those individuals who are now seriously thinking about what future socialism could potentially be like against the idea of mechanically applying the Soviet model to the future, as if socialism simply boils down to the dominance of the state sector in the economy, or to consistently high rates of economic growth.
Well, let's put it this way. Of course, to the dominance of the state sector, that's absolutely essential. There's no way around it.
And to the constant increase in the share of the state in the economy, that's the point. That is despite the fact that in the early stages of the transition to socialism, a private sector is necessary because it provides consumer goods and, in short, fills those niches that are not yet covered.
No, not just in the early stages, but maybe for a very long time, like in China.
Maybe the early stages will last a long time.
But the Chinese openly state that even when we give half of an enterprise to capitalists, to investors, 50% still belongs to us, plus their taxes. And not only is this enterprise economically controlled by us, but on top of that, there is a state structure above it. And we can, by means of the law, you see, turn everything in our favor, control it. That's how it is. This, in fact, is socialism when the state prevails, dominates.
I just picked up my phone because I wanted to explain why, in general, I wanted to analyze this video. The thing is, I went into the comments and I was shocked that there were a lot of, now it's different. Now there are a lot of critical comments as well. And back then the comments were just like, the idea is, as always, well developed. And to make sure I don't miss any details, I need to watch the video again. I love this series. It really highlights the contradictions of the socialist state. Such great analysis, and the book is amazing, superb. And happy birthday to Illich. The video was released on April 2020. Wonderful video. Thank you so much, Alexey. And I was honestly so upset by how unprepared the viewers were.
It's just such naivety.
That you could basically feed them anything, it turns out. How is that possible?
Look, in our case, socialism has certain characteristics. One of them is the leading role of the state in the economy, a planned economy, you see? Distribution according to labor, social equality, and guarantees the absence of polarization. That is, we don't have a situation where all the profits go into the pockets of just one, a certain class, the bourgeoisie. It's distributed throughout society. So, well, in this case, Alexey is completely wrong. And if you say, excuse me, if Alexey says that we don't know what it will or could look like in the future, then with these words, he's already denying socialism as it exists today, that is Chinese socialism. It started with him saying, first of all, socialism was not built in the Soviet Union.
That's not true.
That's not true. Then he goes on to say that even today, as if socialism, well, not as if, but simply that it doesn't exist and we don't know what it could look like.
Let's clarify that in China it's not fully built yet. It's in the process of formation, but China is a socialist state.
Yes.
All to it.
Well, the Chinese themselves say that socialism will be built by the year 50, by 2050. That's their plans. That's what they state in their plans.
Once again, I think we need to explain what it means when we say socialism hasn't been built, but the state is socialist. The thing is, the transition to this socio-economic formation to socialism does not happen the same way as it did with previous socio-economic formations. In the past, these were private property-based formations, and the transition to them, whether to slavery, capitalism, or feudalism, happened spontaneously. In other words, the productive forces would develop, and then the relations of production would adapt to them as a result of social revolutions. But socialism is a different matter, because here we are talking about the abolition of any private property. And that is why this revolution happens consciously. And first, it is the superstructure that changes, in other words, not the base as before. Previously, it was the productive forces that developed first, and then the state superstructure would adapt to them.
So with slavery, why did they kill instead of keeping slaves? Because you simply couldn't afford to feed them, right? Or rather, he couldn't provide enough to feed you. And when does slavery appear? When a slave can provide not only for himself, but also for you and your family. And that's why you don't kill him.
Yes.
And before that, how could you even use that slave if through his work he could only feed himself and you still had to watch over him, guard him, basically?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not economically.
And with slavery, this economic base is then built upon with a superstructure. That is, the state as such appears. But here you just need to read Engels' The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. It's all explained there in great detail. I won't even dwell on that. In short, the point is that there, the superstructure was brought in line with the base, but here, on the contrary, first the base is transformed. That is, first the dictatorship of the proletariat is established as a result of the revolution, and then consciously, through planned economy and the development of the national economy, the base is adjusted to fit the superstructure. In other words, socialism is based on a different principled stance on conscious scientific foundations, and this needs to be understood. And that's why, under a socialist state, when the revolution has already taken place, the state is socialist, but the economy is still in a transitional period in the process of formation. That's the situation in China right now. The state is socialist, but socialism itself has not yet been fully built. I hope I'm explaining this clearly.
In 1934, Stalin declared that the foundation of socialism had been built in the country, since collective farms had become the main form of agricultural management. In 1936, in his report on the draft of the new constitution, he concluded that socialism had been basically built since distribution according to labor had been ensured, socialist ownership of the means of production established, unemployment eliminated, and the exploiting classes abolished. Khrushchev, when he gathered in 1961.
That's absolutely right.
Absolutely right, sort of. And what? What else is there? So you've eliminated the old classes?
Well, and he justified it. He didn't just blurt it out for no reason. He showed that...
You have the dictatorship of the proletariat, you have socialized production, you have agriculture.
Uh-huh.
Everything is state-owned. Well, the means of production, I mean...
Well, mostly, yes. I mean, even those same cooperatives, that's actually a very telling thing, by the way. Khrushchev destroyed them, wiped them out. But what were Stalin's cooperatives? They were economic units that were positioned right in the middle between the state and the state. So the cooperative would receive raw material supplies and equipment from the state, and then the state would buy a significant share of the finished products. In other words, it's an economic unit that's integrated into the overall economy, into the general mechanism.
Yes.
To build communism, he basically reduced it to increasing prosperity and expanding the volume of free goods and services provided. By the way, I also have a video about that.
Well, first of all, it's not just about increasing them. These free services and goods appeared in the first place. So
thanks to the Stalinist economy...
He talks as if back in the Tsarist times, people were just handing things out, giving away apartments, building houses, distributing equipment, gifting land to peasants, sending people to school for free, providing free healthcare, and so on and so forth. As if all of that always existed, and under Stalin it was just the same.
No, Khrushchev is the one who says that.
Well, he started talking about this in relation to Stalin.
Stalin and Khrushchev set the goal of catching up with and surpassing the developed capitalist countries in terms of industrial output. If we had surpassed America, it would have proven that the Soviet path of development truly surpasses the capitalist one.
But the fact that we defeated the fascists, that we defeated the United Europe and the capitalist world in World War II, doesn't that prove that this system is superior to the other system?
It's about the standard of living, you see, the general standard of living, just what it was like.
And at the same time, when we managed to restore the national economy in just a few years after the most destructive war in the world, while, for example, in England they still had food rationing at that time, doesn't that mean anything?
Look, first of all, as it were, Joseph Vissarionovich clearly writes why we have to cover in 10 years the past that took Europe 100 years. In order to win the war, guys, that's the reason. So we were competing with them not to prove that we were cooler. That had already been proven after the first 5-year plan, guys, that this economic system is better. It's simply the future. Again, just look at China today. This was done for the people. And the Soviet Union raised the standard of living, not just for itself personally. The goal was to liberate all the working people of the entire world, and that's why they fought for that first place. They fought for first place so as not to lose the war and to liberate humanity. That's how it was. And not just so that someone could...
Just put a check mark.
Thought that, like, they climbed to first place just to be first, because they were more efficient. No, it was all done for the people.
Neither under Stalin nor under Khrushchev did the withering away of the state and workers' self-management still serve as criteria by which to measure how socialist or communist something was.
That's it. Well, first of all, it's incorrect to compare Stalin and Khrushchev.
But under Khrushchev, they said, what was it that they built? Mature socialism. How did they call it?
Yes.
Ripe socialism? Developed socialism?
Well, first of all, putting Khrushchev and Stalin on the same level is complete ignorance. And secondly, Stalin didn't need to repeat Engels, Marx or Lenin. That is, the discoveries that the Marxists, the classics of Marxism, had already made Stalin fully agreed with all of them. And nowhere did he specifically write that this one was wrong or that one was wrong. So why make a statement? I mean, if Marx, Engels and Lenin have already said everything and expressed their views on this issue.
Regarding the state, Lenin explained everything so thoroughly that, as you said, repeating it a second time would have been simply absurd, especially for people who have at least read it. It's a very short work. By the way, go ahead and read. It's available in audio format. It's just a small pamphlet, The State and Revolution. For those who have read it, it's absolutely clear that this withering away doesn't happen in a year or 2 or 5 or even 50 years. It's a very lengthy process of completely eliminating classes and all class contradictions. That's the first point. And as long as a country exists surrounded by capitalist countries, that country needs protection from those capitalist countries. In this case, you can't do without a state.
So it's clear, Lenin makes it clear that there's no way to pinpoint the exact moment of this future withering away, especially since it's obviously a long-term process.
Somewhere halfway to the goal, in the public consciousness, communism transformed from a society of self-governance, a society without alienation, a society of justice, into a system where everything is free and no one is forced to work.
This isn't halfway to the goal, this is Khrushchev's revisionism, which led to this kind of mindset, where, as the saying goes, take every nail from the construction site, you're the master here, not a guest. That's exactly what it is.
Having taken on the role of the main driver of catch-up modernization, having centralized most of the resources, and effectively depriving local councils of any say in the development of national economic plans, the central government had absolutely no intention of withering away. Not in 10 years, not in 20, not in 50.
So again, who is he talking about? Is he talking about the Stalin era, the Brezhnev era?
He claims it's all the same.
Well, I get it. But I'm saying this for the viewers, like, guys, sorry, but maybe he's talking about Gorbachev? Maybe you're talking about Mikhail Sergeyevich right now?
Uh-huh.
Or maybe you're talking about Boris Nikolaevich then? Like, maybe you're quoting him somewhere too.
It actually started to become a real problem precisely in the 1950s, when the most...
So basically, after the death of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, Let's just say it outright.
Yes.
The obvious steps in catch-up development had already been completed. In certain fields of science and technology, the Soviet Union had reached the forefront, while centralized planning became complex and unwieldy. Khrushchev tried to unleash local initiative.
Right. So now what we have is that the socialist system was fraught with all these troubles and problems, and Khrushchev tried to solve them. And the very first thing he did was abolish the dictatorship of the proletariat, literally as his very first step.
By carrying out the Sovnarkhoz reform. But it quickly turned out that the new Sovnarkhozes behaved exactly the same way as the Sovnarkhoz that Rykov complained about back in 1919.
All right, let's leave Rykov aside. And of course, we need to talk about what Sovnarkhozes actually are, because just mentioning the word isn't enough here. Sovnarkhozes were created in 1957, precisely during Khrushchev's reforms, and they replaced the branch ministries, those Stalin-era branch ministries, which in turn had replaced the Supreme Council of the National Economy, VSNKH. So if the VSNKH was a central administrative body where there was workers' controllees and workers could directly oversee what was being done at their enterprises, well, by the capitalists, so to speak, then this was an early Soviet form of management. That's it. But then branch ministries were established, which proved to be exceptionally effective because it was precisely at the sectoral level that the best planning, scientific development, and coordination between different regions for common goals could be organized. Well, Khrushchev did away with all of that. He disbanded the branch ministries and set up these local economic councils, the so-called Sovnarkhozes. And what was the problem with these Sovnarkhozes? First of all, the Unified National Economic Plan was destroyed. It was handed over to the regions. And the Unified National Economic Plan is actually the foundation of a socialist economy because our whole country lives as a single organism and acts, well, with a single purpose, yes, with a unified goal. And in fact, even Lenin emphasized the necessity of this unified economic center. And what else did the Sovnarkhozes do besides that? They, in other words, fragmented the economy into regional domains, which led to parochialism. That is, each region started pulling the blanket over to itself, and competition for resources arose. And those who were stronger, more successful, more efficient, would pull these resources towards themselves, while the rest, accordingly, were left out. And by the way, this parochialism eventually led to nationalism as well, since certain regions became isolated entities and started setting themselves apart from the rest of the country. I don't think I need to tell you that this was happening there as well in Tatarstan, in Bashkortostan, and in general in many regions. Even here within the territory of present-day Russia, not to mention the republics. Besides that, naturally, all of this greatly weakened scientific and technological progress because it was at the level of industry ministries that specialization and the implementation of innovations were ensured. Well, directly within the industry, right? It's clear how that works. In short, in effect, the Sovnarkhozes undermined the dictatorship of the proletariat in the economy, shifted everything onto regional tracks, and destroyed central planning. In addition, the power of the local bureaucracy increased instead of the same workers' control, because power there did not pass to workers' councils, as would be in line with Leninist principles, but rather to a local party economic nomenclatura, which then decided in its own interests what to produce, where to move, and so on. And of course, what began to flourish there, and this is a fact, was corruption, nepotism, and basically everyone looking out for their own people. And that's when it all started. Well, for example, in Uzbekistan, it was Uzbeks, in Tatarstan, it was Tatars, and so on and so forth. In other words, management was no longer based on effectiveness, but on the principle of it's all friends here, everyone knows each other. So, in fact, on the basis of all this localism, nationalism, and the strengthening of local protectionism, where each region acted in its own interests, restoration of market relations took place, since competition arose between regions for funding and resources. And all this led, among other things, to rising prices, shortages, and wild imbalances, because instead of central planning, the economy became dominated by a kind of market chaos. So the Sovnarkhozes were a huge problem that ultimately led to the collapse of the entire economy.
And here's something else I'd like to say. The focus on people's power in the USSR, well, China became the successor to that approach. And now, among other things, it is waging a very serious struggle, which began back with Deng Xiaoping. For what? They are carrying out a reform of the personnel system, right? So they are strengthening grassroots party organizations, fighting corruption, increasing transparency, and also decentralizing to improve efficiency. This is a program for delegating responsibility. Since 1986, they've started giving more initiative to enterprises. In other words, whereas before the party controls the factory, now the director to be responsible for what happened at that factory. And here's what Deng Xiaoping writes on this subject. Here are a few short quotes. The goal of restructuring the political system, generally speaking, is to overcome bureaucratism and to foster active the initiative of the masses and grassroots organizations. We have done considerable work to transfer authority to the grassroots, but the issue is by no means fully resolved, and so on and so forth. There is the overall goal of this socialist system, yes, is for more and more people, more and more of the population to become involved in managing this system.
And central management does not contradict grassroots initiative. This is something that also needs to be understood, this dialectic, because under this very system of central management, starting from the branch ministries, every enterprise and the workers at each enterprise were interested in increasing labor productivity. They were interested in this kind of innovation, and moreover, they had both material and moral incentives. That is,
the Stakhanovit movement.
It really was a system that worked. But later on, when the bureaucracy truly took power under Khrushchev, when
equalization began when a person who works more gets paid the same as someone who just goes through the motions.
When everything was handed over to the regions, motivation disappeared. And that's exactly when all those penance for excellent work and certificates, which many people in the late Soviet Union loved, started to appear.
And by the way, China also went through this equalization. They called it eating from a common pot, and they also later got rid of it as a relic of the past.
And they do things that are not set out in the state plans. The Sovnarkos reform was rolled back, only to implement the Kosygin reform a few years later, which gave enterprises more independence. And once again, it turned out that when labor collectives are allowed to keep some funds for development, instead of building new workshops, they build housing, kindergartens, and sanatoriums.
The Kosygin reform was not just an initiative of the enterprises, it was a reform aimed at focusing on profit. When the planned targets for enterprises began to be calculated not by the quantity and quality of products produced, but by the difference between income and expenses, in other words, by profit. And what did enterprises that focused on this do? They produced less cheap goods, which the country needed, and produced as much expensive goods as possible. In other words, they themselves created these imbalances locally because of the motivation that was set from above. That's where all those shortages came from and all the problems that existed in the late Soviet Union.
So the decentralization that Safronov was dreaming about at the very beginning of the video,
yes,
right? That's how it was implemented. And of course, people produced the goods that brought in the most profit, and only those. So the number of product lines they offered decreased. Why would you produce something that earns you less? What's the point?
Exactly.
And that's when the famous shortages began.
And you also have to cut costs. And what does it mean to cut costs? In reality, it means lowering the quality of the products. So just like in the late Soviet Union, everything produced in the USSR was poor quality, unreliable, about to break down. And that's why people preferred to buy Czechoslovakian or Hungarian products, those were made properly, right? But here in the USSR, they just didn't know how to make things. That's where it all comes from, you see? In other words, all these economic outcomes have their own reasons.
And by the way, this is the post-Stalinist USSR we are talking about, guys.
Fact.
The pre-Stalinist USSR read up on Soviet school uniforms. The kind you couldn't tear, where you could hang on a nail like Buratino. Not just hard to tear, they used the very best, most expensive, most advanced materials available to people at that time. We're talking wool with silk. You read about it and well. It's incredible what Soviet school children wore. And on top of that, there was a regular, constant decrease in prices. So it wasn't just that wages were rising.
Every year on April honest, there was a Stalinist price reduction. And how was it possible to lower prices? It was due to increased labor productivity. In other words, new equipment and technologies were being introduced, so less labor was needed per unit of production. Naturally, prices went down.
And just imagine, all of this was done according to a central plan, so it was scheduled, and everyone knew that on this date,
On April honest,
there will be a price reduction. Wow!
In fact, there were more than 2 attempts to unleash initiative during the Soviet era. And every time, it turned out that workers tried to use their rights, not so that happiness for all humanity would come in some distant future, but so that in the coming months, or at most years, they themselves could earn more, get an apartment, and furnish it.
And let's not forget that when we talk about the decisions made by individual enterprises in the regions of the Soviet Union during the Khrushchev era, these decisions were not made by the workers. It was already the bureaucracy, the power of the directors.
But he says that this happened twice. Well, all of this was happening under Stalin to Stakhanovite movement, guys. Just read what people were saying, what people were writing, whether in fiction, in newspapers, wherever you like. People were working for their beloved Soviet homeland, which had freed them from slavery. And so I think that what Safronov is saying now is simply a slap in the face to all the participants of the Vova. I mean, guys, people were fighting for their motherland there, not in order to
Furnish small apartment.
save their own skin, or to grab more for themselves, to stuff themselves more. Guys like the ones he's talking about with that burning look in their eyes, well, they were the ones working as police collaborators.
Yeah.
Those kinds of kids who, for a piece of lard, some bacon, for a scrap of some material thing.
And we didn't end not so long ago when we were listening to Vysotski's songs, despite what we said about the contradictions, including those of this figure, we saw that this was a man with a passionate heart who sees justice, who understands what is right and what is wrong. And Alexey, who says that if you give people freedom, they'll just pull everything toward themselves and eat as much as they can.
In fact, right now, if we look at it from a philosophical perspective, he's simply asserting the animal nature that people are inherently bad.
Human nature.
And human nature is just like that, kind of animalistic. What can you expect from it? No, not everyone is like you, not everyone is like those people you're talking about. Unfortunately, maybe you haven't seen other kinds of people, but I have. So we have Safronov saying that there was nothing good there, and that people were just trash.
That's not true. That's just a lie. At some enterprises, decisions were no longer being made by the councils.
Why only at some enterprises? I'm saying even in terms of moral and ethical qualities, he describes people as if the moment they had a chance to run, to steal, to grab things for themselves, they did. No, my friend, it wasn't always like that. It's just that you haven't seen it with your own eyes. You're not able to understand it. That's how I see it.
The system...
Read some books. Sorry for interrupting. Read The Young God, read How the Steel Was Tempered, read Gorky, read more books, and maybe you'll get some idea. Because the great, brilliant authors, they weren't just writing about their own wishes, and not about fantasy socialist realism. Yes, that's the genre. They describe the world that existed at that time and the people who surrounded them. Just read.
And the wealth of those so-called red directors, it didn't appear right away. It developed gradually, precisely thanks to this whole system of localism and the ability to pull the blanket over to oneself. And again, let's not forget that in a collective economy, it's not like the whole country can pull the blanket to themselves. Only those who have the opportunity do so, and it's done at the expense of the workers.
Well,
and this is exactly the formation of the bourgeois class, which was not yet a bourgeoisie, but they were gradually appropriating wealth. And by the late 80s, their goal and direct interest was to change the state, to legalize and legitimize their power.
To formalize the right to private property there.
And originally, the red directors were workers who came to power in place of the bourgeois directors.
Instead of, as Lenin bequeathed, learning to govern the state, the workers strove to get as much as possible from it. And the point here...
Here we go again.
Yes.
So he doesn't make any distinction at all. Those people who fought in the Civil War, yes, the intervention, who were they? Are these the ones you're talking about?
And who exactly is this accusation aimed at? That instead of learning to govern the state, people don't want anything, nothing interests them. That's not true. In fact, during the times of Lenin and Stalin, people were taught how to govern the state, including through the system of Soviets, and there was an entire system for teaching all of this. But it was under Khrushchev that everything really changed. Because of that, public consciousness changed as well. And such accusations are not directed at the workers, as if to say, instead of learning as Lenin bequeathed, you are just trying to pull everything toward yourselves. This is the result of state governance.
So what kind of Marxist is this? I mean...
He's not a Marxist. There's an article by Lazarin, I'll attach it in the comments as well. And here the points are analyzed, including quotes from Alexey's book. And regarding whether he is a Marxist or not, he says that he considers many aspects of the Marxist worldview to be correct, and even thinks that he could happily live under communism if it ever actually came about. So he kind of agrees that if you manage to build something, some kind of communism, then fine, he'll live there. Well, that's his perspective.
But to have such an attitude basically admits that he doesn't know what it is, doesn't understand what it is, then why is he doing an analysis? Well, if you're a capitalist and we're living under capitalism now, maybe you could develop that, say something about the central bank's interest rate. Maybe you could tell us whether that's right or wrong, because a lot of people haven't figured it out. And then, if you consider yourself to be advanced, especially as a scholar, capable of theoretical generalization...
He considers himself an economic historian.
Well, as a historian, I don't know if he doesn't even understand that the Soviet period wasn't homogeneous, then...
He doesn't understand from a political point of view, from the perspective of Marxism, or, well, from a philosophical standpoint either.
He doesn't understand at all.
Yes.
Not only in the decades when local interests had to be sacrificed for the sake of national security. Even in cases where the Union government granted territories or enterprises more rights to manage their resources, no forms of developing horizontal connections were created. Simply put, the management of an enterprise could spend funds on developing their own enterprise or on social benefits for their workers. But there were no mechanisms for the directors of enterprises in the same city to independently form a unified local budget and spend it on comprehensive urban improvement. Naturally, nothing could come of this except for the group selfishness of individual production collectives. Individual collectives were given slightly more resources than before, but they were not allowed to pool these resources and use them for common goals. At the same time, every time more rights were granted locally, the central government was not prepared to reduce national development programs. In other words, these rights were not backed by material resources. When it came down to allocating bricks, either for a centralized construction project or for a project initiated from the grassroots, the choice was usually made in favor of the centralized project.
And that is absolutely correct. I mean, how does he not understand this? And he's an economist, right? Honestly, I'm just, well, to be honest, I'm shocked.
I was also stunned when I watched that video.
So, according to him, in his particular model of the world, it actually turns out that all workers are, in his view, essentially thieves who only ever think about themselves. All the bosses as well are considered thieves too, who also only ever think about themselves. And it turns out that as soon as they're given the opportunity to steal, they do.
And the state tried so hard to do everything right. And in general, the state's goal was to improve everyone's lives. But people are just so...
No.
That's why they just can't do it themselves.
No, the state had a choice to let the thieves steal or to do something for the good of the state. And the state chose to do things that would benefit the state. So what's so bad about that? I don't understand. Why give that brick to the thieves? Well, that's what you call them. Look, there they are in your pictures carrying sacks. I just don't get it.
In the end, every time they tried to encourage independence, it led to imbalances and shortages, and the reform had to be rolled back. Catching up.
And again, we're talking about...
Yeah, he's saying that every time they did the right thing, do you get it? They always did the right thing. But it led to even bigger problems.
Socialism doesn't work.
It doesn't work. A planned economy is unviable because no matter what, the state makes the right decisions, but everything still falls apart at the local level. Or sometimes the local level wants to do things, but the state ruins everything. Basically, it just doesn't work out. It's an unviable...
Chinese socialism.
That's not socialism, that's imperialism. Have you forgotten already?
Yes.
Modernization was necessary in Soviet Russia not only to create the material foundations for socialism, but also to establish the conditions for the development of a business culture among the working people. At the end of his life, Lenin wrote that it was precisely the lack of culture that prevented the immediate establishment of genuinely socialist forms of production and distribution, such as product exchange.
No, actually, we've already read out quotes that show Lenin was not a utopian. He didn't have ideas like, oh, our people just aren't the right kind. Oh, how are we supposed to manage with such ignorant, greedy folks? No, Lenin says that we are materialists and we proceed from the transformation of real life. And as people find themselves in different living conditions, they change and social consciousness transforms in response to changes in social existence.
In The State and Revolution, he quoted Engels, saying that we will have to wait until a new generation of people grows up under new conditions, so that all this rubbish of statehood can be thrown out. But as this new generation grows, it is necessary to create accessible forms of participation in governance for them, rather than simply, during the next round of reforms, leaving a bit more resources at the local level than usual and saying, well, fine, you can spend it on whatever you want. Now, whenever I write something on the internet about the need to develop horizontal connections and local self-government, there are always people who object. Have you seen neighborhood or parent group chats? It's a nightmare. These are people who can't agree on anything. Do you seriously think they can manage anything properly? And the critics are right. Right now, at this moment, they can't. Lenin never said that any cook is capable of running the state. He wrote that it is necessary to do the work to teach her how to do it.
We demand that the training in state administration be carried out by conscious workers and soldiers, and that it begin immediately, that is, that all working people, all the poor, be immediately involved in this training. Is there any other way for the people to learn to govern themselves, to free themselves from mistakes, than through practice, than by immediately embarking on real popular self-government?
This is what Soviet power is. This is the meaning of Soviet power.
This work of teaching the people to govern themselves was in fact practically a failure in the Soviet Union. This was not due to ill intent, but because the incredibly difficult conditions in which the revolution triumphed, the country's backwardness, and the hostile environment required, on the contrary, the concentration of all resources on the main tasks. You cannot develop popular.
These are different things. Managing the system and concentrating resources.
Yes.
These are different things. And under Stalin, as it were, there was also concentration. That is, there was both the first and the second, actually.
The concentration of resources is the foundation of socialism. It is impossible without concentrating resources and central management of the entire economic organism to create this very organism, yes? Because if every part of the country, every region pulls the blanket over to itself, as happened, as I already mentioned, with the Sovnarkozes, it will lead to nothing but nationalism and the collapse of the country.
And how is it that a country where this didn't work out managed to win World War II, standing against the whole world, basically?
Well, by accident.
But how?
Regardless.
Well, inspire. Now the topic has shifted to in spite of. The familiar in spite of sim. And in spite of. China is not socialism. Yes, I keep forgetting that.
Self-governance, if the people have no resources to manage, then there's nothing to practice on. In full accordance with the laws of dialectical development, the catch-up modernization, carried out from above by the forces of the Soviet state, which was necessary for socialism over time itself, increasingly became an obstacle to socialism.
But it became an obstacle to socialism not in the course of its own development, but after the opportunists and the revisionists seized power, who, using their authority, redirected the country and its economy in a different direction, abolishing the dictatorship of the proletariat.
In the video, it looks like you're just talking into the table like this.
Let it be into the table, whatever, let him go read a book. What is he talking about? Some kind of dialectics. You just haven't read any dialectics, Safronov. You haven't read dialectics, anything in accordance with the dialectical method. You know, you just heard some vague talk.
The workers saw their needs sacrificed time and again for various reasons.
Again, the working people in what year? Under whom did the working people see this? Under Stalin? Well, read the letters from workers to Stalin, read the letters to Lenin, to Kalinin, the speeches of these figures. Do you understand? And what are you talking about? What happened again under Khrushchev? What happened under Brezhnev? What happened under Gorbachev? Is that what you're telling me?
Due to objective strategic considerations, that's why they perceived.
He shows that Lenin standing on the armored car was like this. Damn it, giving the workers 2 zeros right there. Here.
No, that's
What are you? Stalin is already standing.
that's exactly the essence of Trotskyism when you use Stalin to attack Lenin and so on. That is, Lenin was still calling for the withering away of the state, but Stalin had already done everything wrong.
Yeah, right. So they don't see the Chinese at all. China doesn't exist.
Why do you keep bringing up China?
Well, yes, sorry.
Expanding their economic rights as an opportunity to quickly improve their situation before the state changes its mind and rolls back the next reform.
Yeah, there were people like that during the Great Patriotic War too, right? Tell me. Those who try to do things quickly, you know.
And the state, by periodically granting either regions or production collectives more rights to manage resources, did not back up these rights materially and did not create a mechanism for people on the ground to spend the resources left to them on common goals, overcoming the boundaries of individual enterprises. When I described this problem on the internet, I immediately received objections that what I was proposing was market socialism or anarcho-syndicalism. I found myself in good company, because back in 1917, Lenin himself had to defend against accusations of anarcho-syndicalism in that very article where he writes about teaching workers to manage the state.
He heard a bell ring, unsure where.
You're not in the same company as Lenin if you didn't realize you're with Rykov, with Bukharin, with all that riffraff. That's whose company you're in.
Yeah, and they were more consistent.
And
Because they never came up with such nonsense, like starting all this here, like why have taxes, why have any of this? Even they wouldn't allow themselves to go that far.
why wouldn't they? Because they were in the party right next to Stalin and Lenin.
They couldn't do that.
They couldn't allow themselves to do that, you see? To spout such nonsense.
It's just shameful and disgraceful. And it's embarrassing for those commentators who don't even see what they're being fed.
Market socialism implies that labor collectives trade with each other, compete with each other. In general, they behave like capitalists. The regulator.
Where did he even get that from? Well, that's just his theoretical generalizations. Market socialism. Guys, socialism is not market-based. He can use socialism, yes,
Instruments.
market instruments, but under the control of the socialist system, right?
Well, in general, trade, what we're talking about here is basically the exchange of goods. How else could it be?
So in the Soviet Union, that was the NEP for a few years. In China, they adopted this model and have been using it successfully since the time of the respected Deng Xiaoping. In other words, they do not allow liberalization. Why would they need that?
But we'll talk about China in another place.
Let's do that.
The market, where cooperative enterprises operate, determines the proportions of social reproduction. There is no planning in it.
That's called capitalism.
Centralized planning is optional and only serves as a guideline. The very fact that many readers found it difficult to imagine a centralized yet democratic economy shows just how much our social thought has in fact degraded.
Yours has, yes.
Democracy relates to politics, but when we talk about planning and the creation of this system of material goods reproduction in the economy, well, here democracy is about distribution, not about decision making.
Yes, I honestly didn't even know what that was at all.
To present things as if socialists have only two alternatives, either a centralized state with unaccountable power that oppresses everyone for the sake of a great goal, or a market-based.
Why would it oppress anyone? If we're talking about central planning, if we're saying that our whole system develops as a single whole, where does oppression come into it? If every person lives better, if they start eating better, have more access to education, to, I don't know, clubs for their children, to swimming pools, to vacations at the sea, at resorts, in sanatoriums, if all of this keeps getting better and better, how can you say that anyone is being oppressed?
And why unaccountable? What's this about accountability? By the way, Joseph Vissarionovich used to just read his reports to the voters, right? Read the party report, read the economic report. Well, if you're an economist, just pick up at least some book and read it. So now he's claiming that there is either, I don't know what he calls it, some kind of state socialism in the form of fascism. It's just fascism.
He even uses a picture to match
there's some kind of market socialism.
With a human face, you get it?
There's no such socialism, nor the other kind, neither of them exist. You know, I don't even know, buddy.
There is an objective reality which we rely on when it comes to economic planning. We make decisions by looking at today's economy and seeing that we have failures here, 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 and here. In order to ensure our development, we need to develop, I don't know, microelectronics, aircraft manufacturing, and, well, some agriculture, a number of industries. And then we look at, having set these goals, what tools we need to use in order to develop them. So we identify the tools, see the resources we need to engage for this, figure out where to get the funding, and off we go. Yes, our plans may change, they may be revised in the course of implementation. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's how it works, even, I don't know, with the family development, that's how it works. That's how the development of an individual works. It's normal, right? When someone makes plans and carries them out, well, what can we even say about the national economy then?
So, let's talk about what it means to use the market. We had the NEP, it's gone now, right?
Yes.
So a different system ended up prevailing. And by the way, the NEP was never officially abolished. Some people think that the NEP was first introduced and then later switched off. They turned it on. In other words, they realized that the economy couldn't cope without trade, yes, without capitalist enterprises because of the famine and all that. They told the capitalists, guys, you can operate now.
Go ahead and work. But at the same time, banks, heavy industry, and railways remained in the hands of the socialist government.
Not only did they remain in the hands of the socialist government, but they were also developed by it. And industry grew, and as a result, it pushed the small market traders out of the market. Because a small trader who makes a bucket for 5 rubles can't compete with a large enterprise that sells the same bucket for 5 kopecks.
Yes.
And he leaves the market with his little bucket and goes home, and everyone else leaves the market too. That's all there is to it. Different system prevails. Or take China, on the other hand, which enters the international market. And in order to enter it, to maintain a policy of openness, it needs technology. It takes technology. It takes investments from the international market, right? It implements all of this at home, but does not allow in the ideology the liberalization that is with the Soviet Union in the 1980s turned its gaze to the West and said, I want things to be like in the West. China did exactly the same thing, only it did not allow foreign capital to dominate. It did not hand over the levers of control, right?
Well, it's not quite correct to say China did the same thing, because China assessed its own real situation and realized we have certain rights, and they are connected to the underdevelopment of our production. And if we had more, well, production of consumer goods, like, you know, things like that, agriculture, then this problem would be solved for us, and we could, well, engage in this planned distribution. But since we don't have that, we have to build it all. And then the question is, how are we going to build it?
Yes, and that's it. They let the market in, partially allowed it into their system under the control of the socialist state, and that's it. That is, dominating the market component both economically and politically. That's all.
Socialism that is barely different from capitalism is a false opposition. Workers can develop a plan of collective action, not in a market struggle with each other, but through the mediation of the state, which processes information about their wishes and production capabilities, but does not abuse its role.
What are your production capabilities? Come on, tell me.
Wishes?
Capabilities first?
Well, I'll put it this way. I have capabilities, but I don't want to share information about them. I want to talk about my wishes. I want an apartment, a car, and I want to work as little as possible. Those are my 3 wishes. Please, let's gather some more...
And your capabilities?
My capability is to consume.
You should give me the capabilities.
No, I have the capability to consume, and I want to satisfy it.
Okay.
The executive branch apparatus should administer the process of interaction between labor collectives. And here's another thing, look, he still doesn't understand what exactly. That in our system, the party leads the vanguard. Right?
Party has vanguard.
Yes, yes. Then come the workers, right? And then the workers lead the peasants. So it all goes deeper and deeper and deeper. But the center of control, ideological, philosophical, social, any kind, is always the party. In other words, without the party, a revolution is impossible without the party. Without the party's leadership, a revolution can't happen.
Yes.
A socialist revolution, imagine, is impossible, and it's also impossible, for the Soviet state to exist without the party. Just imagine, it's impossible. Yes.
Soviet power.
Yes, and without the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's impossible. Can you believe it? And without the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, it's impossible. And he says, sorry, but damn, the party isn't needed at all.
It's not mentioned at all.
It has nothing to do with anything. The dictatorship of the proletariat isn't needed. So by Safronov-style thinking, the capitalists are just like, we're people like everyone else. In other words, he has no understanding of class theory.
He has no understanding of class theory.
So, like we're all sitting here, I'm sitting here. Next to me there's some oligarch, then there's some homeless guy, then a drunk, then another oligarch, then a scientist. And we've all gathered together and we have a social contract. Let's all just...
Yes.
Well, of course, the oligarchs will say, of course, Artem, let's cook some dumplings together over the campfire. Naturally, we'll split everything equally right now.
In his view, a revolution has already happened, there's already some kind of socialist system, and there are no more oligarchs, and people are supposed to join hands in harmony. Well, you're absolutely right when you say that he has no idea about the form of organization of this proletariat. He denies and ignores the dictatorship of the proletariat, the leading role of the party.
And the role of Marxist ideology, of Marxism-Leninism, that too he thinks is unnecessary, but you see, then what? Did Lenin ever do anything normal? I mean, even during Lenin's lifetime, was anything normal being done? Well, he was just acting out of necessity. Fate, that is, destiny, fate.
And although the party is the vanguard of the proletariat, that is a representative acting in the interests of the working people, at the same time it does not mean all people. It's a vanguard, it's a organized organization.
Which leads the proletariat acting in its interests, and the proletariat acts in the interests of the whole society. Because the proletariat needs doctors. So they should also live well.
Scientists, peasants, teachers, everyone.
Everyone who will work for the benefit of the proletariat. That's why it's the leading class.
And not to impose their will on them, using resources taken from them in the first place.
They took resources from the peasants, took them from another class. Here he doesn't understand again. They took them from the capitalists. What are you going to take from the peasants? Leaky lamps, bark, damn it, that they well scraped off and chewed with some water from a puddle. What are you going to take from the peasants?
No, he expected instead the party, the nomenclatura takes things away from the people.
And already the revolution happens automatically. Sorry, I forgot. According to Safronov, the revolution just goes wham. Ah, yeah, or maybe you know what else, not wham, but the party comes, the revolution happens, and then the party goes on vacation.
No, and then the party degenerates according to the Trotskyist tradition and starts taking everything from the people.
No.
Well, or it remains.
No, that's how it was, he says. But how do we build a new communism now?
No way! It'll come, and when it does, it'll stay.
That's what I'm saying, but it can only come if the party...
But he doesn't care about that. When communism comes, he'll live there. For him, it will...
What a sly one, look at that. But look, should we even be asking a person like that what he wants? I mean, he openly says, I'm not really a communist, but I'd live under communism. And then under communism, we'll have to ask him, Safronov, what do you want? And he'll be like, I want a garage, damn it.
A Zhiguli.
Zhiguli. And we're like, of course, why would we need a tank in our Red Army? Safronov gets a Zhiguli. And as you can imagine, there are 60,000 people like Safronov. For example, in the PCH Telegram channel,
They tried to build such a system through the pyramid of Sovnarkozes, when the fullness of economic power belonged to the local councils. But the Supreme Council of the National Economy, VSNK, coordinated and unified their activities. At that time, they failed to build this system. The conditions?
Why did it fail? It's just that the branch ministries replaced the VSNK because the economy was developing.
because Soviet scientists, Soviet political figures, they just weren't capable. But if he had been the one building it, well, then
The VSNK was a form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, including in the economy, in its management of the national economy.
And then, look, Rykov could have built it,
Bukharin,
Bukharin could have, Trotsky would have built it just fine. It was all Stalin.
with his voluntarism.
Of course, with Lenin, damn it.
The prerequisites for the democratization of economic life only emerged by the 1960s when the USSR
Tada.
Tada!
So things got better after Stalin.
People could finally breathe easy.
First, things got better when Engels and Marx died. Then when Lenin died, it became even easier to breathe. When Stalin died, it got really good.
Popov won't let people have peace.
he ensured his own security and developed industry quite well. The Kosygin reform was structured in such a way that, for example, the director of a factory producing uranium shovels could spend additional resources only on expanding the production of uranium shovels, bonuses for workers, or building departmental housing provided he could find the construction materials. If the uranium shovel factory has a lot of money and the workers really want a new Zhiguli car, which is produced at the neighboring factory, they can't invest their resources in developing another production, either directly nor through the state plan. The only thing they can do is buy a finished Zhiguli. But if the production of Zhiguli cars lags behind, then no matter how much bonuses for over-fulfilling the uranium shovel plan increase, there still won't be more Zhiguli cars in the country. Instead, either inflation or shortages will arise. Now imagine that during the Kosygin reform, workers could spend resources not just narrowly on their own enterprise, but could plan the development of anything within the unified state plan for a certain amount, submit a request for.
And what's most interesting is that this video is well thought out, it's scripted, it's recorded, and it's read from a teleprompter. It's not, an impromptu thing like what we're doing now, just a reaction where we have the right to make mistakes, misspeak, or blurt something out. Here, though, every single word is carefully considered.
The development of the production of some product they need, which neither Gosplan nor the Politburo would be able to cancel anymore. And the better this collective works, the more rights.
But what the hell for? Listen, why the hell do you need the Politburo, huh?
Why at all?
Why the hell do you need the Central Committee? Why do you need all these party people? They're just freeloaders, right? Why do you need them? So that they can't cancel it.
He says Zhiguli. He says when an enterprise produces, say, uranium shovels and overfulfills the plan, let there be more Zhigulis.
Listen, and why doesn't he want to apply this now under capitalism, huh? Well, we should just get rid of the entire State Duma, get rid of the entire Federation Council. What do we need? The administration.
I would actually agree with a lot of that.
Get rid of the presidential administration and all those people too. Just, the central bank, or not the central bank, just abolish the ministries. Let's just send requests directly by phone from wherever we are.
A Zhiguli for me?
Directly to the factory.
Uranium shovel.
I'll cast a spell on Alena there.
And the sack of grain for me.
When drawing up a unified national economic plan, it is included. So there you have material incentives not outside the plan, but within the plan.
Oh, I've got it.
Hey, what kind of plan? So, I want a Zhiguli.
Put it in the plan?
And they're like, yes, ministry, we're listening. The ministry.
There's no ministry, it's gone already.
No, the planning ministry. How did they write the plan?
The plan, right?
The planning ministry? Zhiguli. Put a Zhiguli down for Volkov.
For Safronov?
And for Volkov too.
And the combination of democracy and centralism. Yes, according to Lenin, socialism should be a state monopoly, but a monopoly that serves the needs of the entire people. In the USSR, an explicit system of economic mandates from voters to their deputies was never actually established. Workers had no choice but to hope that the higher-ups wouldn't forget about them or to fulfill their needs outside the plan. Let's sum up.
Fulfilling their needs outside the plan.
I don't even have any ear for music at all, but yes.
Fulfilling their needs outside the plan.
The abolition of private ownership of the means of production does not yet mean real socialization. Workers must be taught how to govern the state, and for that, we have to accept that workers will regularly draw up development plans so that useful things are produced for them.
Draw up plans so that useful things are produced.
They'll be riding around the stores on their mopeds. There's Tamara Nikolaevna, please add to the state planning committee whatever you wanted. She's like, clothespins.
Now we have the internet. Now you can just submit a request in a Telegram channel.
On the government services portal.
By the way, to be fair, jokes aside, studying needs, that is demand, also has to be taken into account for planning. That was taken into account. First of all, enterprises themselves would submit information about how much they had sold and how much they hadn't. During Khrushchev's time, there were big problems with this because, well, they would just report numbers. Well, obviously, whatever you produce, that's what you reported as sold, and it was very difficult to assess shortages. But before that, the system worked well. And in general, department stores had the ability to collect this information, what was missing, how many requests there were. Even now in commercial companies, I don't know, many of you probably work in sales and see how this works. So you have a sales department and you collect a spreadsheet from them. How many requests did you have for products that you currently don't have in your assortment? And then the marketing department or whoever is responsible for this evaluates what else we can add to our assortment, this, that, and so on, so that demand will be satisfied.
Quantity?
Yes, or the quantity. So this isn't that difficult to assess even in small commercial companies. In large enterprises, this process is even more streamlined.
So the workers should be able to do it too, if it's not that hard. Just hand out Excel spreadsheets to them and let them write down what they need. What a great idea.
Instead of supplying oil to brotherly countries or building bases in the Arctic for
brotherly countries, really.
And bases in the Arctic, what nonsense when we need the Zhiguli Alexey guys.
Why on earth should those workers from other countries, he's got this kind of nationalism.
Disgraceful, outrageous.
Such a nice, solid kind of nationalism. What's up with these brothers, right? Yeah, at your own factory, it's all for yourself. Yourself, yourself, me, me, me. What happens at the neighboring factory isn't my concern. The country isn't my concern.
Why do we need space? Why do we need polar bases? Why go to the ocean when a person needs a Zhiguli? Come on, have some conscience. Who's making the plans over there, guys?
Give Safronov a bowl of sausages, a bowl of dumplings, a mug of beer, and let him...
And a scooter.
Well, what else could he want? Just give it to him already, that's all. And by the way, he doesn't even want that. He writes that he'd rather live under communism, not socialism, meaning he doesn't want from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
According to work?
According to work, yes. He wants to jump straight to that, so that...
As needed now.
Yes, yes, exactly.
boats or flying to Mars. Catch-up modernization in the Soviet Union was necessary. But now we live much better than Soviet Russia did in 1920. And besides, we have a nuclear shield. That's why the future proletarian state must be very careful not to, in the name of some great goal of catching up with or surpassing someone in the production of something, take away the right of localities to participate in state planning. In the early stages, after the overthrow of the exploiters' oppression, the working people will use their new economic rights to address some of their immediate smaller needs. Most likely.
Well, let him finish.
I've come to you about a small need and now I'm spouting nonsense here. About a person's small need?
Please include my small need in your grand plan.
The share of consumption in the national income will increase, while the share of accumulation will decrease. This means that society will develop more slowly than if a new modernization leap were organized. At first, society will change structurally, becoming healthier, more open, and more conscious. But not until...
But how? I don't understand. Will it become more conscious?
Because everyone will be able to participate in planning.
Ah, so it happens by itself.
Well, here everything really depends on where the country stands in the international division of labor and in the world in general. If the situation is like Russia's current one, where we need to ensure food sovereignty, technological sovereignty, military sovereignty, and so on, then without prioritizing investment over consumption...
Why?
We need to spend more on developing the economy, on building wealth, to put it simple, on building more and more enterprises that will provide us with a happy life, rather than consuming everything by buying it from abroad, which is essentially what Alexey is proposing. That's the essence of his idea. When consumption outweighs investment, which is what he's talking about, when your country doesn't produce its own goods, you have to buy those goods from abroad. That's exactly what modern Russia is doing.
Right now?
Yes.
So we're just being led down the path of some kind of airplane, right? Exactly that. No, it's even worse. We also have to destroy the planning system.
If it's socialism on top of that, then they'll just destroy the country. That's it.
The foundation of fantastic GDP growth rates in the 20th century, the socialist choice was a chance for developing countries to break out of backwardness. Many did break through, but socialism, in the end, was never fully realized anywhere, because catch-up modernization exaggerates the role of the state and hinders the development of socialist social relations. For socialism to be genuinely attractive in modern conditions, it must mean a healthier society without exploiters, where working people have the rights and opportunities to freely and independently improve their lives on their own terms as they see fit. The task of teaching people how to manage should be more important than the task of achieving high growth rates.
So you get it, right? Socialism needs to be attractive. Alexey is more conscious. He doesn't need to be convinced he's already ready to live under socialism. But this video, yes, but this video is for those who still need some persuading. So Safronov says, guys, everything will be fine, everything will be free, everything will be just like that.
Well, that is, he is now attracting the petty bourgeois line to his side.
Bourgeois?
To the Philistines. Like under socialism, guys, you can build a kind of socialism where you don't have to work, where you just send in your wishes and needs.
Voting services.
Yeah, and in response you get exactly what?
Puns right in your mouth.
Whatever it is you want, but who's going to do the work?
So, shall we draw some conclusions?
Let's make a theoretical summary of these views.
First of all, let's say that this video is not just some throwaway clip, but the result of many years of work by Alexey Safronov and his proposals for transforming the theory of socialism.
Well, let's put it briefly what we want to say. First, Alexey denies that there was socialism in the past, that the USSR was, right? He denies that there is currently any socialism anywhere, meaning he doesn't recognize Chinese socialism. And accordingly, his views suggest that socialism simply won't be built if we rely on
proper theory.
On the theory of Marxism-Leninism, on the experience of Stalin's Soviet Union, or on the experience of modern China. We don't even mention any of that.
Besides that, we've discovered something else. We've found that Alexey doesn't understand class theory, that he doesn't understand the theory of revolution or the theory of socialism. I mean, the role of the party, the role of the Soviets, the very form, the form of organization of Soviet power. We ignore this and do not understand it. What else have we found out? That Alexey does not understand the principles of how a socialist economy is structured, which is surprising considering that this is what his life's work is dedicated to. In addition, Alexey does not understand the contradictions within socialism and the political transformations that led to its degeneration and destruction. And this, in fact, is the most important thing in the economy of that period. It's not enough to just look at what was, fact. You can't draw any conclusions from that, and we have seen this firsthand.
So, roughly speaking, he's revising the history and theory of communism.
Absolutely.
Including that.
Yes.
So, it turns out he's a revisionist, right? He is unscientifically revising all of this. And under the guise of this revision, he promotes reactionary views. such as anarchistic views. And not just anarchistic, but some completely backward anarchism that doesn't even rely on, say, Bakunin's scientific approaches, more like utopian anarchism. So what he's talking about
It's fantasy.
has nothing to do with communism. It's pure anarcho-utopianism. That's all there is to it.
Aha, is that all?
What else is there? Well, and of course this is slander against the classics of Marxism. So if...
But Rico is a decent guy, Bukharin is good, no problems there.
And he glorifies enemies of the people like Rykov, like Khrushchev.
He compares Stalin and Khrushchev, but whatever, that's just details, let's not get into that. In short, guys, please be attentive to the theoretical information you receive and to the information you watch. That's why I keep telling you that you need to study series. There's no way around it. Because if you don't understand the foundation, the basis on which Marxism-Leninism is built, then things like this can slip by unnoticed, and you simply won't see where you're being deceived and where falsehoods are being told. And here, in every word, there's just revisionism, a complete re-examination, and a total lack of understanding of the theory.
We will attach links to the works we've mentioned here below for your reference.
Yes.
If you're interested, read them.
Yes. That's all. Goodbye, everyone.
All the best. Farewell, comrade.